All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. As always, I am absolutely thrilled that you are here. If you have never checked out the program before, we are primarily an interview and a commentary podcast. We are going to be doing some commentating for you today, if that's a word. On the studio line with me today is Shaman Isis. Shaman, welcome to the program.
Hello, Billy. Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. What we're going to talk about today is a couple of things. We're a year out, but already the election is a big issue. And I'm not really going to talk about the individual points of fact with Republicans and Democrats and all of these other things. I do want to talk about what scares me is people talking now. When you hear them talk, people have always been entitled to their own opinion, and they still are, of course. But we are seeing a trend now where people are basically having their own facts, bending the facts. I heard a term the other day that's interesting. I don't know if you've heard this, Shaman. It's called a zombie lie. And what that is that it works on the axiom that if you repeat something enough, people will believe it, no matter what it is. If you just keep repeating it enough, people will believe it. And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to maybe touch on the idea of free speech. And I've made no secret of the fact I've been trying to get one of the candidates on the program. It's a long shot, I know, but because there's so many major podcasts out there that are vying for their attention. But one of the things I would like to ask them is, how can you have a reasonable message now when so much of the populace is in a bubble? They're in a bubble. They're consumed with their ideology. They're consumed with how they feel the world is or should be in their own mind. So how can you penetrate that when you're running a major campaign now? How can you penetrate that? Here's kind of what sparked this podcast, and I'll kind of let it unfold. And then, of course, my co-host today, she is very skilled in the workings of public relations and all of these other things. So she can bring a lot of value to this conversation. I was listening to a video that I ran across. I don't know if it was on TikTok or what it was, but there was a young lady in the video, and she was scolding her trolls. And she was saying, if you're going to say negative things about me, I'm going to block you. If you don't like my content, you can just move on, which is very reasonable. And she went on to say that I am not going to take negative comments from strangers who don't know anything about me and let it affect me. Okay. So you can just move right along. Now, and on the other hand, if you want to contribute positivity to this page and bring a lot of positive energy and positive comments, you are welcome to do that. Now, that's fine. But it begs the question, if total strangers can't contribute negative comments that have any value to you because they don't know you, how are these positive comments? How do they have any validity? And it speaks into what I've been saying for a long time, that we have become addicted to positivity. And I know I always get hit with the strongman argument that, well, you like negativity? And I say, yeah, sometimes I do like negativity, because I'll tell you why. Negative people rattle your cage. Positive people only reinforce what you're already doing, even if it's not so hot.
Yeah.
So, Shaman, if you notice this, or I've increasingly become I've been overcome with the feeling that I'm the only one that feels this way, because I always get, positivity is so important. I always get this lecture. We create our own reality and all this other stuff.
Yeah. And there's truth to all of that.
There is.
Well, you've hit on something that I was actually talking to some of my students about today, and I'm trying to explain to them how they have to look. They have to learn to look at the information that is being brought to them, and not jump in with both feet simply because they hear something that they want to believe.
Yeah,
Because you don't, unless you understand, excuse me, the agenda behind why someone is presenting a particular point of view or fact to you, you really can actually create embarrassment for yourself. You can also perpetuate something that's not true. And in the case of the woman that you brought up, an example for that is that I think what she is almost a reflection of what has been happening over the last 20 years with the information age and media no longer obeying the tenets of good journalism. It has had a trickle down effect to the point where once media took on the ability to just pick and choose whatever story and however they wanted to have a point of view about it without presenting both sides of the story, eventually, because we're all media now, every single person with a microphone, with social media, we're all basically perpetuating our own media platform. And what that's done is just it's echoing itself within people who are producing content. They want to put out what they think and feel, and they don't want to hear anything else back because they're not accustomed to having to being able to challenge a narrative, much less do they want the narrative challenged that they're putting out there. And what that
yeah.
does is that you don't have a negative feedback cycle. You don't have anything to challenge your position to make you grow and evolve and see things from multiple perspectives. And honestly, it's quite dangerous.
Absolutely. It most certainly is. Creating your own reality, as it were, is never really a good thing. And I want to be very clear here. You can get very philosophical about this, in philosophy and in science. Even what you might consider to be an absolute truth
Yeah.
is very elusive. However, in my day, that being the case, and absolute truth is very elusive, there still was a wider norm in terms of what the facts were.
Hmm.
20 or 30, 40 years ago, let's say back in the days of 1980s politics, there were Republicans and Democrats, and there were liberals and conservatives. And they had their differences, to be sure, but they all agreed that the way to the sky was up. They all agreed certain things. And now that is kind of out the window. Now we have people who are creating their own realities. And what's happened in the public and in the media as well. When I first heard the term fake news,
Hmm.
I was very concerned because I knew that fake news, that term, was going to be used when you heard something that you didn't like or
Yeah.
that you didn't agree with. It was going to be fake news. I knew that it would go beyond the meaning of what it was originally intended. And when you and I talked earlier before our studio time started, we talked about the word disinformation,
Hmm.
and it's been used before, but it became another term during the pandemic with Fauci and all these other things.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, you had these platforms that were stopping this, what they called
Mhm.
disinformation. Okay. And that started a whole free speech conversation. And without,
Yeah.
I understand free speech in governmental terms, that Congress will pass no law. I understand in the strictest sense what free speech means. But in the common vernacular, Elon Musk said this, and I do agree. A lot of these platforms have become de facto town forums.
Mhm.
And especially when you are pretty much a monopoly, and the only place to share these things is on one or two different major platforms.
Yeah.
When somebody starts deciding what is fake news, what is disinformation, when somebody makes that decision for you, is that something you are happy with? Now, as it turned out, a lot of the stuff that got labeled disinformation was true.
Amazing.
Yes,
Well,
and
and I have some points on that
sure,
that I
go
want
right
to bring
ahead.
up. Well, a couple of things. One, we do create our own reality, but that reality is our perception of how we see what is happening within our own life. it is not about defining the external world. I think that what was happening there is that people are playing with the terminology. Because I teach people how to create their own reality, but that's about creating a reality, a personal experience in life, and choosing your point of view, and learning how to be happy within the circumstances that you have. But you also need to be a part of the change that needs to take place in society. Creating your reality does not divorce you from being a part of your community and helping to deal with things like disinformation, which is actually a really huge problem. Disinformation has been weaponized. The phrase was weaponized during the closures, to shut down conversations that people didn't want to hear about, to shut down points of views that people didn't want to hear about, and I think it's actually quite concerning how that's sort of grown to the point where people are now creating their own disinformation and believing 100% in what they're saying and just running with it, and it's just creating so much noise that people can't focus on dealing with the problems that need to be addressed, and that includes politicians.
That is a fantastic perspective. That's why you're here. That is a fantastic perspective. I'm so glad you laid that out because that's such an important point. Where I was kind of leading to was when it comes to disinformation. Here's the issue. Time sometimes can bear out the truth, and when you shut certain aspects of the facts off to the public, they don't have a chance at that information and making that 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 decision themselves.
Yeah.
And here's where I have a lot of empathy with some of these major platforms that say that they really, if they have to regulate it at all, they really should not regulate it either one way or the other. They shouldn't somehow try to police it. Either let it go or just simply state certain subjects are going to get shut down. And here's why. We're going to be getting into the political season here where you're going to start seeing a lot of local and national ads about certain politicians and certain issues that need to be voted on. Okay. And how do you, if you are a platform or if you're a media company, you're a broadcaster, how do you know where the truth is and where it isn't? For example, let's say there's some kind of a thing up in some state about building a dam. Okay. And there's a group of people that are for it, and there's a group of people that are against it. The people that are against it say it's all going to benefit big industry, it's going to harm the environment, blah blah blah. And all the people that are for it say, oh, the same old usual talking points. This is something we need. It's going to bring value to our community. Da 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 da. Da. Okay. Now, you could take 10 given facts, pick 7 of them, and state your position,
Hmm.
and all those facts independently would be true. And you could take a different 7 and take the opposite side of the issue, and all of those 7 independent facts would be true. But how do you, as a broadcaster or a media platform, how do you decide in that moment what is disinformation? What is fake news?
Hmm.
Okay, who is the arbitrator of that? Who is making that decision? And my argument would be nobody can say that for sure.
Yeah.
And what do you want big money, or do you want people who are in control of these platforms making that decision for you? You don't need to see this side because it's fake news. You don't need to see this side because it's disinformation. You don't need to worry your little head about this. We'll take care of it. Is that a fair assessment a lot of times of what happens?
Well, that is what happens. One of the reasons why, and I've been vocal for 2 decades about social media platforms and media platforms, because I was working in Manhattan when media used to actually fact check what information they put out there. They not only fact checked it, but they tried to point with every story. They went to a lot of trouble to present both sides as they could discover the facts of the situation. But what I have seen happen over the last 20 years is no longer do they present both sides. They present a point of view that gets the most attention, and they sort of leave the viewer to figure out like how much of that's actually true. And I think what has happened is that people are no longer using their discernment to discover the truth. So one of the things that's going to be so important in this election are human beings involving themselves in the process and looking at the candidates and their energy and the way that they behave as human beings, how they come across and how their intuition interprets them as people, because it is going to become difficult to discern the information that's being thrown out there about different candidates, because it's become the wild west of fact checking and the wild
Yeah.
west of information. So it will be on, the onus is on humanity to involve itself. What, it's ugly, but it's an important part of being part of the adult population,
Yep.
and really getting to know the candidate so that you can use your intuition to understand what you believe to be true about somebody. I
Yeah.
think for me, that's going to become very important in this election, because you can't believe what you hear in the news media anymore or in social media.
No, no, that's the thing. There was a time when there was a certain reasonable assumption, in the days of Walter Cronkite.
Oh, yeah.
He very famously he had the news that Kennedy was dead on November 22nd, 1963. Somebody handed him the paper that the president is gone. And he said, "Do we have this verified?" And the feeling was, "No, but go with it because we have to announce it. We have to be first." He goes, "No, we don't. We
Oh,
have
love
we
that.
yeah, we have to be right. We don't have to be first." And I those days, for the most part, are gone.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a ratings grab now.
Mhm.
I'll ask you this: back in the Cronkite days, news was pretty dry. You had this middle-aged man, looked a lot like me, except he didn't have long hair.
Hardly, hardly, Billy.
And he had the little pocket protector, and he talked very matter of factly, and
Mhm.
well, that's the way it
He
is.
took it seriously.
Yes, absolutely. Could that sell today? Could he hold an audience today? Do we need the entertainment? Do we need the fighting? Do we need the throwing chairs?
Well, I think if you look at the statistics that mass media have been dealing with the last few years, you see it's not working, and now they're sort of hanging on by the skin of their teeth by focusing on clicks, getting using headlines and to get attention, to get clicks, to sell advertising. It's like, I don't know. That's actually an interesting question. I do think there would be a market for someone like a Walter Cronkite, especially right now, if it was done
Yeah,
right, spun properly. Um, but I think they've lost huge swaths of younger generations because of the drama.
yeah. Well, that's kind of where I was going to go next. I kind of feel that is I've asked this before. Is journalism as we know it dead? And the other side of that is there an interest in journalism?
Mhm.
Because of the fact that we have become so entrenched in political ideology now, we want to hear what reinforces what we already believe. That's why you
Yeah.
have CNN has an audience, Fox News has an audience, and they cater to those audiences because it's all about ratings, selling advertising, and so on.
Mhm.
So a lot of times, bad news is in terms of what your audience is not going to like, is bad business. And that's the problem. Back in the Cronkite days, there was a certain amount of public service that came with the news, and that's gone. It's entertainment now. It's right there with football. It's right there with all that stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
how can you bring in an audience to hear the same stories in a way they want to hear?
Well, I think where there is hope is citizen journalism. To me, is the future of journalism, and I think that as people become continually disgusted with their inability, and I know I passed that pet fence post a few years ago, as somebody who's been dealing with
Yeah,
media for a long time. What you're seeing is that people are starting to become almost desperate for information that they can count on as being having some validity to it. So people, or I think it will be two front. There'll be people who actually do return to journalism that are journalists, and then citizen journalism is going to take on a profound new importance in our society, and people will begin to trust citizen journalists who really try very hard to present the truth. And if they don't know for a fact if something is truthful, they're going to have that conversation with the intelligent audience that we have now. Because a huge difference between the days of Walter Cronkite and now is that we have a much more educated populace that you can say to them, "This is what I
yeah,
know." And I think that's where the direction we're going to have to move in.
yeah. Well, I would hope that's true. I would like to see, a middle-aged nerd who just gives the facts, as the saying was back then, just the facts, ma'am.
Yeah.
That would be successful. But I'm very skeptical that it would be right now. And I'm just being honest with you because the the bubbles that are out there now. And it's just, I know it by the negative comments that I get, from the podcast. I know it from the negative comments that I get on social media. And it's getting to the point now that I know it from the negative comments that I get socially. I'm going to irritate. I'm going to piss off both the right and the left right now because and I know when I piss both sides off, I know I'm right.
This is true.
The right wing right now is trying to change behavior based on a moralistic platform. And here again, whether you're for it or against it, all this abortion talk. When you hear someone talk about, I won this election because God wanted me to win it, that's actually a very dangerous comment. Claiming divine intervention in an election is a very dangerous step, something that the forefathers did not want.
Yeah.
And the left right now is also trying to control you as much as they say they're not.
They all are.
Yes.
It's pretty blatant.
Yeah, sure. They are, telling us how we should speak, changing terminology, accusing you of being any type of a hater if you don't use the words they want you to use. And both sides are pushing that.
Yeah.
And this orthodoxy on both sides. It used to be, here again, going back to my days of youth when Reagan was president, there were people on the fringes. You had right-wing nut jobs and you had left-wing wackos. And I'm using pejorative terms for a reason.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
I'm using those terms because the vast majority had differences. But here again, we all agreed which way was up. We all agreed the sky was blue. Okay. And now these orthodoxies are becoming, on the two ends, are becoming the majority. And free thinkers, independents, people who what I would call have common sense, are becoming squeezed more and more into a smaller and smaller area.
Yeah.
And that is what kind of really scares me about. It's not so much when somebody has a conversation with you now. Here again, when I was in school and we got into a conversation about Reagan, the concern was he was going to start World War III with the Russians. That was the big scare back then.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And, we would talk about it and somebody would bring up a point and you'd say, oh, yeah, you are right about that. And well, what about this? And you'd make a point and somebody say, yeah, well, that's true. And you both acknowledge that you had a certain amount of given points that had validity. Yeah. Now that never happens. When you're talking to somebody now who's entrenched in this ideology that they have, they won't acknowledge that you have a fair point no matter what it is, because they're not interested in reaching a common ground with you, like you were talking about.
Yeah.
What they are interested in is driving an agenda about how they feel the world should work.
And that's where we're at. I believe that is a result of years of not only having mass media do the same thing, because that is what's been going on. When you're not reporting both sides, you're reporting a point of view, and they all have an agenda because they're all owned by large corporations that have an agenda. And then you have social media where having a point of view is how you build an audience because they're mirroring mass media. And then you have algorithms that serve up to people more of the opinion that they already have. They become desensitized to other people having an opinion or hearing other opinions. So what's happened over time is this has accumulatively made people really uncomfortable listening to an opinion that falls outside of themselves, and that's where it gets. That's where it's gotten, and it's become quite dangerous because people have really bought into what they believe being the facts.
Yeah.
I do see hope though, because we're having the fact that you and I are even having this conversation out loud, and there are other people out there that see that. That's a place we weren't at 10 years ago.
Okay. Fair enough. I would hope so. And then that was it's funny that you said that, because my next question was going to be, how do we get through this? That's one of the questions I would really like to ask one of the candidates and their managers. I mean, if you're honest and truthful and kind of boring about for lack of a better term, about our future, that doesn't get the base riled up.
Yeah.
Okay, we want people jumping up and down.
And they're
Okay,
scared, and I'll tell you right now, the politicians are absolutely scared of the facts that will actually force this conversation. So I would say, and I'm just gonna jump in because
go
I have
ahead.
a couple of thoughts on this. So, 10 years ago, it's like 13 years ago, I wrote an article where I was warning people that social media was, accumulating data that people didn't seem to understand was being accumulated. And
Hmm.
it was because as a marketer, I was able to access it, and when I saw what I was able to access, I was so taken aback. I was like, "I've got to tell people." I mean, I knew it, but I didn't really understand just how profound it was, and no one believed me
Hmm.
because they weren't ready to believe me. And then eventually enough scandals happened, enough truth came out where now when you say that social media is accumulating all this data on people, most everybody actually understands that to be true. And they, you have conversations about change, and there's at least a push for change. My point in that is that it is the truth of situations. It is repeating the facts. So in this election, bringing up the truth and the facts of what the average American person is actually battling and dealing with in this country is going to be so important, and keeping them on point and and focused on fixing what is wrong, because we haven't seen wage increases in decades, but we've seen rents nearly double in the last 15 years. Like it's pretty frightening for the younger generations, and I think
Sure.
that is what we have to do to make this election at least move towards a resolution, and to help people begin to, it's through repetition and repeating something until somebody's actually in a place to hear it, that we get people to move towards that change. So we're going to have to keep repeating these truths, and there you can look at, we have to pull the facts out and keep repeating them, because
Yeah.
it's the only way to move everybody towards change. And when enough people have dealt with these situations, suddenly they hear. So some of the older generations are starting to actually understand that these younger generations aren't lazy. They're facing unprecedented problems that the older generations never had to deal with.
Yeah.
So, that's just my perspective on that.
No, it's a good perspective. Before we wrap things up, I do want to throw one more thing in the way of fake news and
Mhm.
what to believe and what not to believe. This is probably going to be the first election, and my guess is in elections that come, it's going to be a far worse problem. But I can see the potential for fake news in the form of AI becoming more of a problem than it's ever been before, especially when it comes to social media. It used to be when you had a videotape of somebody saying something, that was it. Okay, that's the smoking gun. That's not true anymore. I came across one of these developers on Twitter the other day that had this beautiful woman in a bikini, and his tagline above it was, "This is AI." So how do you feel when it comes to data collection, when it comes to discerning what is true and what isn't? How are we going to make our way through that AI minefield?
That is such a brilliant question. I love talking about artificial intelligence. It's one of my favorite topics, and I think that's where we go back to. You've just pointed out why regulation of artificial intelligence is so incredibly important. I think what is going to happen is people are going to begin to believe nothing,
Yeah.
which is as dangerous as people believing a particular point of view that they want to have. And I think by creating regulation on artificial intelligence and penalizing, I mean, that's just the truth. And I hate regulation. I hate big government. I think we
Right.
need to be efficient, not more efficient. I think that by making some examples out of people before it turns into a Cambridge Analytica situation,
Yeah.
that's the only way we're going to, by spanking people right up front, and making sure that we're in as much as we can controlling how it affects information. Is I was telling my class, it was one thing years ago when when you had to put out a story about a company because there were books that were dated. They had dust on them. They actually showed the history of what something was. With artificial intelligence and the new age of information, companies can nearly rewrite their history.
Hmm.
And that is why it's so important that we have a way of tracking the truth and
Yeah.
calling out and penalizing anybody who manipulates that.
Yeah.
It's interesting, and I love artificial intelligence. It's going to usher in abundance and to make things less expensive. There's so many positives to it, but it's also, in terms of information and people being able to know what the truth is. That's one of the reasons why I think citizen journalism and journalism are going to take on newfound importance.
Yeah. Yeah, that's all great stuff. And Shaman, I got to tell you, you bring so many things to the table, and everything we talked about is going to remain current for a very long time. I hope when something hits your desk that you want to talk about or you want to debate, that you reach out, because these conversations every once in a while I think are absolutely fantastic to have with you, and I know the audience loves them. So thank you
Yeah,
so much
no, thank you.
for coming on. And before I let you go, where can you have your own podcast,
Mhm.
and tell us where you can find the podcast. And I know you're on the old Twitter, which is X now. Tell us where people
Mhm.
can find you.
Yes, you guys can visit shamanisis.com and you'll see links at the bottom of my website that take you to all the social media where I'm pretty active, like Twitter and TikTok. My podcast, The Shamanisis Show, can be found on YouTube and Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So go check it out. I cover all sorts of things like politics, science, and technology, and of course, spirituality.
Awesome. That is absolutely fantastic. Shaman, we love having you on here. My name is Billy Dees. You can find the Billy Dees podcast pretty much anywhere podcasts are found. It's just the Billy Dees podcast. You search it right up. I should pop right up. The show's been in existence almost 10 years, not quite, but getting close to 10 years in its current form. I'm doing it longer than that, but in this form, it's been around since 2016, something like that. And also on Twitter, or X now. X is what it's referred to, at
I
Billy
keep
D.
doing that. I'm sorry.
At Billy D's on Twitter X, as Elon says, just X. X marks the spot. So, Shaman, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Really appreciate it. And to our audience, just let me say thank you so much for checking out the program, and we will talk to you again next week.